1936, in a workroom at a museum in Hobart, a man laid a set of bones out across 5 pieces of card. His name was William Cunningham. He was the taxidermist at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and the job in front of him was ordinary work. Take the skeleton apart, arrange the pieces so a science teacher could point at them one at a time. Tan the skin flat so it could be rolled up and carried to a classroom. He finished the job. The cards went into the education collection, alongside the other teaching specimens. The flat skin went with them, and over the following decades it was unrolled in front of schoolchildren learning about marsupials. Nobody recorded where the animal had come from. There was no catalogue number. There was no entry in the zoological register. There was no line about it in the annual report the museum published that year. The animal had died on the night of the 7th of September that same year, in a cage at Beaumaris Zoo on the Queen's Domain, a couple of kilometres from the workroom. It was the last thylacine alive on the planet. There is a piece of film you have almost certainly seen. About a minute of black and white footage shot through the wire of an enclosure. A striped animal paces the length of its cage, turns, and paces back. It opens its jaw impossibly wide and holds it open. It scratches. It lies down in the dirt and looks at the camera. That film was shot in December 1933 by a naturalist named David Flier, who set his camera up at Beaumaris Zoo and filmed for as long as the light lasted. Flier was bitten on the backside during the session. The animal in front of him was male, and for most of a century, museums, documentaries, and textbooks told you the same 3 things about him: that his name was Benjamin, that he was the last of his kind, and that when he died, the species died with him. 2 of those 3 things are wrong. Start with the animal itself, because the picture in your head is probably wrong too. A thylacine was not a tiger, and it was not a dog. It was a marsupial, a carnivore that carried its young in a pouch, and it had arrived at a body plan that looked almost exactly like a wolf's, without being related to one in any close sense. Stripes across the lower back and the base of the tail, a stiff tail that did not wag, and that jaw, which could open to something close to 80 degrees, wider than nearly any other mammal on Earth. They were once spread across the Australian mainland. By the time European settlers arrived in Tasmania, the island was the last place they lived. Then the sheep arrived. Farmers blamed thylacines for stock losses, and from 1888, the Tasmanian government paid a bounty on every one killed. £1 for an adult, 10 shillings for a pup. Over roughly 20 years, the scheme paid out on more than 2,000 animals, and those were only the ones claimed. Trappers snared them, shot them, and dug them out of dens. By 1909, the bounty scheme had been wound up, and the reason was not mercy. There were not enough thylacines left to make it worth paying for. The speed of the collapse is what researchers have argued about ever since. Bounty hunting alone may not account for how completely the animal fell away in the first years of the 20th century, and one long-standing argument holds that a disease moved through the remaining population at the same time, in the way distemper moves through dogs. Sick thylacines were reported in captivity in that period. The evidence is circumstantial, and the case is still made rather than settled. Either way, the outcome was the same. Within about 20 years, the animal went from a species with a price on its head to a species almost impossible to find. Here is where the story turns on a detail that is easy to miss. As the animal became rare, it became valuable. Zoos in London, in Europe, and in Australia wanted one, and by the 1920s, a live thylacine was worth serious money to anyone who could catch one. And almost nobody could. Beaumaris Zoo kept trying. Through the early 1930s, the zoo's thylacines died one after another and were not replaced, because the animals had simply stopped turning up. The trappers who had made a living from the bounty went out and came back with nothing. Expeditions were mounted into the southwest. They found tracks that might have been tracks, and heard sounds that might have been anything. Then, in the middle of May 1936, a trapper named Elias Churchill walked out of rugged country in southern Tasmania with a living thylacine. He sold it to Beaumaris Zoo. The sale was never written down. There was a reason for that. Ground-based snaring had been made illegal, and Churchill had caught the animal in a snare. Recording the purchase, or announcing it to the newspapers, would have exposed how the animal was taken and left him open to a fine. So the zoo took delivery of what would turn out to be the last member of a species, and put nothing on paper. The animal Churchill brought in was an old female. That matters more than it sounds, and it matters for this reason. The famous male, the one in the Flier footage, the one the world has been calling Benjamin for decades, had died months earlier, in May of that year. The female arrived at the zoo shortly afterwards. She was the one who lasted. Now count the days. In July 1936, after decades of bounties, after the trappers had run out of animals to trap, the Tasmanian government granted the thylacine full legal protection. Killing one became a crime. 59 days later, the last one was dead. She died on the night of the 7th of September 1936, in her cage on the Queen's Domain. The account that has been repeated ever since is that she was shut out of her sheltered sleeping quarters and left exposed through a cold Tasmanian night. The National Museum of Australia describes her death as possibly from exposure and neglect. Possibly. Nobody at the zoo wrote a formal account of that night either, and the record does not settle it. What the record does show is what happened to her body. It went to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, a short distance away, and was handed to William Cunningham. And then it disappeared. Not stolen, not destroyed, simply absorbed into a museum with tens of thousands of objects in it, without the one thing that would have made it findable: a label saying what it was. For 85 years, that was the state of things. Researchers wanted the remains of the last thylacine. They were the most significant animal specimen in Australian natural history, and they were worth finding. Curators searched the zoological collection at TMAG and found no thylacine material dated to 1936 at all. The conclusion most of them reached was that the body had been thrown out, that in the confusion of a zoo losing an animal it had not officially bought, the last of a species had gone into the rubbish. Meanwhile, the species itself was formally declared extinct in 1986, half a century after the fact. That 50-year delay was not bureaucratic sloppiness. It was hope. Expeditions kept going into the Tasmanian bush, and reported sightings kept arriving. Hundreds of them, decade after decade. A shape crossing a road at night. A set of tracks. A sound in the dark. Not one has ever produced a confirmed animal. And in 2022, while that search was still running in the background, a genetics company announced a project with the University of Melbourne to attempt something else entirely: to reconstruct the thylacine genome and bring a version of the animal back. Whether that succeeds is an open question, and a contested one, but it means the specimens matter more now than they did in 1936, because everything anyone will ever build has to be built from what was kept. Which made one gap in the record impossible to ignore. Of all the thylacine material in the world, the single most important specimen, the last one, was the one nobody could produce. The answer came out of paperwork. Robert Paddle is a comparative psychologist at the Australian Catholic University who has spent much of his career on the thylacine record. Catherine Medlock is a curator of vertebrate zoology at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Working through unpublished museum material, they came across a taxidermist's report from 1936 and 1937 that had never been made public. In among the list of specimens worked on that year was a thylacine. That single line changed the search. If a thylacine had passed through the taxidermist's hands in that window, it had not been discarded. It was somewhere in the building, just not in the part of the building anyone had been looking in. Paddle and Medlock audited the museum's entire thylacine holdings, every skin, every skeleton. Each one was traced back to a record, a donor, a date. One by one, the specimens were accounted for and eliminated. At the end of the process, two things had no origin at all: a flattened, tanned skin, and a disarticulated skeleton, its bones laid out and fixed across 5 cards. The skull told them the rest. The wear on the teeth was the wear of a very old animal. She had been in the education collection the entire time. The collection overseen by the museum's science teacher, catalogued for classroom use rather than research. The skin had been tanned flat, precisely so it could be transported easily to schools. Generations of Tasmanian students had handled the last thylacine on Earth while being taught what a marsupial was, and not one of them was told what they were holding. She is on display at the museum now, in the thylacine gallery, identified at last. So go back to that piece of film, the striped animal pacing the wire, opening its jaw, lying down in the dirt. It is the most watched footage of an extinct species ever recorded, and it is the image the world reaches for whenever it wants to feel something about extinction. It is a real thylacine. It is not the last one. That animal was already 4 months dead when the last of the species was carried out of the bush in a snare and sold to a zoo under the table. The last thylacine was never photographed, never filmed, and never named. She was bought illegally, kept unrecorded, died in the open on a cold night less than 2 months after her species finally became protected, and was then taken apart by a man doing routine work in a museum workroom, who laid her bones out across 5 pieces of card because they were the right size for a classroom. Which is the part worth sitting with? Extinction is rarely a moment anyone recognises while it is happening. It is paperwork not filled in, a purchase not recorded, a night nobody wrote about, and a body handed to a taxidermist who had no reason to think this one was different from any other. The last of them did not vanish into the wilderness. She went into a box, in a building, in the middle of a city, and stayed there, in plain view, for 85 years. They found the last one in a cupboard. They still haven't found the animal so many people swear is still out there, the shape crossing the road at night, the tracks that lead nowhere, the sighting that never quite holds up. Inkaroo keeps pulling on the stories Australia decided were finished. Subscribe and stay on this one.